June 6, 1944. Before the history books recorded a victory, there was only the deafening roar of diesel engines and the freezing spray of the English Channel. Thousands of seasick, terrified men sat crammed in steel boxes, heading straight into an impenetrable defense. They were in those boats because the Soviet Union was bleeding out. For 2 years, Joseph Stalin had pressured his allies to open a second front in the west to draw Hitler's forces away from the meek render in the east. This map shows the scale of the obstacle keeping them out: the Atlantic Wall. It was a continuous 4,000-mile chain of concrete bunkers, minefields, and artillery batteries, stretching from northern Norway down to the Spanish border, consuming 13 million tons of concrete. Failure on these beaches meant leaving the Red Army to face the Nazi war machine alone. If the invasion collapsed, the Allies would lose their only window to liberate Western Europe. To crack the wall, the Allies assembled an armada. Crammed into the ports of southern England were 130,000 men, ready to board 7,000 vessels, under the cover of 20,000 aircraft. But all that machinery was hostage to the weather. On June 4th, a violent storm lashed the channel. Eisenhower had to halt the ships at sea, anxious that any delay would alert the Germans to the hidden fleet idling across the water. When a brief break in the weather finally appeared, the vanguard moved out. Hours before the amphibious assault, 20,000 airborne troops strapped into their harnesses, preparing to drop behind enemy lines in the dark. They knew their odds of survival were essentially a coin toss. Years of meticulous planning were over. The outcome of the war rested on the unpredictable friction of nature and the endurance of exhausted young men. The strategy relied on wiping out the German coastal defenses before the troops even arrived. Starting at 3:15 in the morning, thousands of planes and offshore naval guns pounded the coastline, but navigating by instruments in poor visibility, nearly all the bombs and shells missed. The Atlantic Wall was fully intact. Approaching Omaha Beach, the reality of that failure set in. To avoid enemy artillery, the landing crafts were released into violently rough waters miles away from the target. Strong currents immediately dragged the flat-bottomed boats off course. When the ramps dropped, the heavily burdened seasick soldiers stepped directly into concentrated machine gun arcs. The unsuppressed German positions turned the open water and exposed sand into a firing range. Within hours, the beach was littered with dead and wounded. The slaughter was so severe that American commanders stationed offshore actively discussed abandoning the Omaha offensive and leaving the pinned-down survivors to their fate. The grand strategy of Operation Overlord evaporated upon contact with the sand. For the men on the ground, the war shrank to the few yards in front of them, and the only goal was surviving the next few seconds. Order collapsed entirely. Weighed down by heavy equipment, men drowned in the deep water before even reaching the shallows. Those who made it to the shore grouped together in terror, transmitting desperate messages that they were nailed to the spot by artillery. This schematic reveals the trap they walked into. To escape the open sand, troops had to cross a stretch of deeply mined shingle, navigate barbed wire choke points, and reach the cover of a seawall, all while taking relentless fire from the fortified bluffs above. With officers dead and radios lost, small, fractured groups of men took the initiative. They shoved explosive tubes called Bangalore torpedoes under the wire to blast open escape routes, inching up the bluffs by finding blind spots between the German firing arcs. Alongside them, medics and combat engineers crawled through the crossfire. They had to make brutal choices, leaving the dead and dying behind to focus on blowing apart the beach obstacles so the next wave of boats could safely land. Individual soldiers, often leaderless and exhausted, secured the beachhead at Omaha, winning the foothold inch by inch through pure, unyielding grit. Once the beaches were secured, the Allies deployed an engineering marvel. They towed massive concrete caissons, codenamed Phoenixes, across the channel and sank them to create artificial harbors. This allowed them to pump tens of thousands of vehicles and millions of tons of supplies directly onto the coast. But advancing inland meant entering the Norman bocage, a maze of ancient, thick hedgerows dividing the fields. It was a tactical nightmare. American tanks were forced onto narrow dirt roads where a handful of hidden German defenders could stall an entire battalion. The stalemate broke in late July with Operation Cobra. Heavy bombers pulverized the German front lines, allowing American armored divisions to punch through. General Bradley then orchestrated a massive pincer movement, trapping and annihilating the retreating German forces at the Falaise Pocket. In that pocket, the German military's capacity to hold Western Europe was decimated. The grueling trap of Normandy was broken, and the road east to Paris lay wide open. As the Allies approached the capital, political reality set in. General Charles de Gaulle demanded that his French armored division be the first to enter Paris, a calculated move to assert his authority and restore French national sovereignty. By late August, Allied troops were parading down the Champs-Élysées. After 4 years of brutal occupation, the jubilation in the streets was overwhelming. It was a picture-perfect image of liberation. But miles away, on the shores of Normandy, the true cost of that parade remained. On D-Day alone, over 10,500 Allied soldiers were killed, wounded, or went missing on the sand. The liberation of a continent required thousands of young men to step off those ramps into the dark, enduring a bloody trial that secured the freedom of the Western world.